Today, I'm going to show you how to edit your images in Lightroom Classic. Hey there and welcome to Phlearn. My name is Aaron Nace. You can find me on phlearn.com where we make learning fun. And in today's video, as a part of our Intro to Lightroom Classic series, we're going to show you how to edit your images in Lightroom. This is a simple process and you can make a huge difference to your photos. Keep in mind, this is the third video to our Intro to Lightroom free series. So we're going to be picking up where we left off in our last video. So if you're watching this and you're like, wait, what happened before this? All you have to do is go back and watch the previous videos and we're going to link to those right down below. So here we are in Lightroom Classic, and you can see some of our images have stars on them, some of them have color ratings, and that's because in our last video, we showed you how to choose your favorite images, a process also known as culling. So what I want to do now is just refine my selection so I only see my favorites, and then we're going to edit some of those. So let's go here in our library filter. I'm going to click on Attribute. Now, if you don't see your library filter, just go to View and make sure that Show Filter Bar is checked. So here in our attribute, I'm going to go ahead and say, show me everything that is the color red. There we go. And the color yellow, because these were my final picks from our last episode. And now it's time to go ahead and edit one of our images. So we're going to start with this Intro to Lightroom 18. So let's go ahead and click on the Develop tab. And here's where we start our editing process. So in my opinion, Lightroom makes photo editing very simple. All we have to do is adjust a series of different sliders. So let's go ahead and show you those from top to bottom. So here we are in our Develop module. Now, everything here in the right-hand column, this is where our tools come in for actually editing our image. And over here in the left-hand column, once we've created an image that we like, we can create a preset, we can create snapshots for multiple different variations, and we have our history. So everything is totally undoable. For instance, if you're editing and a dog or a cat walks by your keyboard and let's say they make some changes and you're like, no, my photo was so beautiful. Don't worry about it. Just go back in your history and you can go back to your original state and it's just gonna undo everything. Fantastic. You can also click this reset icon right down here in the bottom. So if you make any mistakes at all, don't worry, it's not permanent. So up here on the very top, we have our histogram. Now, this is a visual indication of the light information that's on the right-hand side and the dark information that's on the left-hand side of our photo. Now, ideally, you don't have anything all the way to the right or all the way to the left because that's going to mean you've lost some information. And in fact, if I hover over this little triangle here, you can see with this photo, we've lost a little information in our highlights, okay? That little red area, that's telling me that I don't have information there. So the first thing that I want to do is basically, let me go ahead and click there. So it brings this up. I want to make sure that I take my highlight level and bring that down a little bit. You can see just by taking that down just a little bit, now, basically, I'm pulling a little bit of information back from my highlights. We're editing a JPEG now. If you're working with a raw photograph, you're going to have even more room to push and pull your highlights and shadows. It's going to look more natural. So here we have a few advanced tools at the very top. We're actually going to be covering these in the next video for advanced editing. So for now, let's go ahead right down to here where we see our white balance. Now, your white balance, you can actually choose your white balance if you want to, auto, custom. If you're working with a raw image, it'll say like daylight and cloudy and that sort of thing. Now, if you use your little eyedropper, you can actually click on a target neutral, which would be like a gray area, and set your white balance. Now, in this case, because we don't really have any gray areas, I don't want to use this eyedropper. That would be really beneficial if you photographed with a gray card, and then you could use this to get the exact perfect white balance. Now, you can also adjust your white balance just with these two sliders here. So you have our color temperature, there we go, and we have our tone there. All right, and again, I can just go back to reset at any point in time. Here we go to where we recovered our highlights. Here we have our exposure slider, makes your image brighter and darker. All right, let's go ahead and reset that. We have our contrast, increases and decreases the contrast. Again, I'm gonna pull my highlights down so we have information there. Let's go ahead and turn our highlight warning off for now. We have our shadow levels. This is actually really nice. Highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. I really enjoy using these as a starting place instead of starting with exposure because looking at an image like this, I'm like, yeah, our shadows are pretty dark. You might be inclined to just boost your exposure, which just makes everything brighter. But the fact that I can just take my shadows and make those brighter without affecting my highlights, that's one of the things that makes Lightroom incredibly powerful. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll increase our shadow levels, and then you can take your white values and then bring them to the left or the right here. And you can see I'm actually able to recover some of that information in my highlights as well. Okay, and you can do the same thing with your blacks. So these tools are incredibly straightforward. Literally just click and drag on any of these sliders. You can type in a number here if you want to as well. Now, for our presence, basically this is kind of like sharpening. You can add texture, which will add like little details. Let's go ahead and zoom in, okay? And here we can see our small details. Clarity is basically like the same thing, but on a larger scale. Let's go ahead and zoom out so we can see that here. And then dehaze is going to be fantastic if you do have any haze in your image. You can actually add haze, which is kind of like fog if you want to. Generally, we're not doing that. Okay, and then here in the bottom, you have your vibrance and saturation sliders. Now, vibrance is a fantastic tool to use, especially if you have people in your image, because vibrance will ignore skin tones, so those orange colors. So you'll be able to increase the color in your image without overdoing the skin tones. Now, in this example, because our person is underwater, their skin is kind of like a little bit blue anyway. So let's go to another example in this series and show you basically the difference between vibrance and saturation. So you can see as I bring up my vibrance all the way to 100 here, wow, the image looks stunning and our skin tones still look pretty good. Now, if I take this down to 0 and bring my saturation all the way up, you can see my image looks good, but the skin tones are starting to look way too saturated, okay? So if you do have people in your photograph, I highly recommend using vibrance. So you can see here, vibrance, and then boop, that'll be down to 0 versus saturation. You can see the skin tones look much more natural. So here's with vibrance and here's with saturation. Okay, so the skin tones look much more natural with vibrance. All right, let's go back to our other image and start scrolling on down. So next we run into our tone curve, and this is actually very similar to curves in Photoshop. So for instance, we could click and drag to make our darks a little bit lighter, and we can make our lights a little bit darker if we want, reducing our contrast. You can also go in here and change your different color channels. So if I wanted to do like a duotone, for instance, I could bring up some blues into my shadows and pull down the blues in my highlights and create a duotone image. Okay, now this is pretty extreme, I realize that. Let's go back to our original settings. But if you're familiar with using curves in Photoshop, basically you have the same tools here in Lightroom. You just want to make sure you click this little icon right down here, okay? So if you click this little icon, by default, basically you have these highlights, lights, darks, and shadows. If you click this icon, then you're going to be able to go through your different color channels and create your own tone curve. Next, we're going to be working with our color. Here's where we can target certain colors and make them more or less saturated. We can shift the hue and shift the luminance. So let's go down a little bit here. You have the options if you want to see just the hue, saturation, luminance, or all. And in this case, what I like to do is use these little round icons. Let's go ahead and click there. And as I click and drag on my image now, this will actually adjust the hue of wherever I click and drag. Okay. Again, let's go ahead to an image that has a little bit more difference in colors. So let's click on my hues, and I can see if I click and drag here, I'm basically just targeting the yellow in this little kayak and adjusting the hue. Or let's undo that. Okay, I'll click on this hue, go ahead and target that hue range, and it's going to start editing that. So you'll notice it doesn't necessarily know that it's like just editing the part of the little paddle here. It's going to edit anything with basically a similar color. So if you want to adjust your blues, you could just click here and it's going to start adjusting all the blues in the image. Or if you wanted to just adjust your greens, you can click and it's going to start adjusting all the greens in your image. Okay, hit undo there. Now you can do the same thing with saturation and luminance. So for instance, if you're like, oh, these blues I want to be more saturated, just click on your blues and drag up or down, and you get more or less saturation. Okay, maybe you're like, those yellows, I don't want to be as saturated. Well, there you go. You can create something like that, which kind of looks kind of funny. But here we can do the same thing with our luminance as well. For instance, if I want to make this red color a little bit lighter, I can do that. If I want to make our sky a little bit darker, I can do that as well. Maybe I want to make our greens a little bit brighter. So let's go to our greens and make those a little bit brighter. So all of these changes I can make within my hue, saturation, and luminance. Next, we're moving into split toning, which actually allows us to create a little bit of a color grading effect. So let's go back to our original image here. We're going to go down to our split toning, and here's where I can actually put some colors into the highlights and shadows. So we can choose what color we'd like and then increase or decrease our saturation. So let's bring our saturation up for now and then choose our different hues. So again, if I wanted like a warm color in my highlights and then let's say a cool color in my shadows, I can do this and create a cool split tone image. So here would be the before and the after. So this is really for color toning. I would say this is a little bit outside of the scope of basic editing. I would do all of your basic editing first, and then if you wanted to, you could color tone afterwards. Moving down the list, next it's time to sharpen our image, which will basically add a little bit more detail. So let's go back here and go back in our history to our highlights. Here we have a little display in our sharpening area. You can actually click here and view different parts of your image. So let's view our subject's face. And I can sharpen my photograph. I can bring my radius up, which will increase the amount of sharpening. And I can increase or decrease the amount of detail, which is basically small areas within our photograph. And then if you want to mask areas like skin, this is going to help you just sharpen the edges. So sharpening in Lightroom does work pretty well. In my opinion, I actually like sharpening in Photoshop a little bit better. I think it looks better, but a little bit of sharpening here in Lightroom, just keep these settings nice and low, something like that. It's going to look pretty good. Now, if you do have some noise, you can reduce that noise here, and you can reduce color noise here as well. Next, we're moving into lens corrections. Now, this is super cool. Basically, Lightroom will know the camera and the lens that you used and be able to correct things like distortion and vignetting automatically. So if you're bringing your own images into Lightroom, I highly recommend doing lens corrections. Now, in this case, because we're working on just a stock photo, it's not going to recognize all that stuff. So if I turn this off, I'll just say enable profile corrections. It's going to have a little bit of trouble knowing which camera took this. But that's totally okay, because if you want to, you can do this manually as well. For instance, you could adjust your distortion. Okay, if you shot with maybe a wide angle lens, you would want to adjust your distortion a little bit, and you can adjust your vignetting. Now, there's one more area where you can adjust your vignetting, and that's here on the bottom tab, effects for post-crop vignetting. And you'll see we do have a bit of vignetting here. Like, these corners are pretty dark. So let's go ahead and bring this to the right, and that's going to make my corners a little bit lighter. I could bring this to the left, and that's going to bring my corners darker. So I want our corners to be a little bit lighter. Let's bring this to the right. Okay, now our midpoint we want to adjust here. Let's go ahead and bring that in. All right, start working with our roundness. Basically, my goal here is to make this totally seamless. Let's bring our feathering up. I want to make this totally seamless in, lightening those corners, but not being able to see that, hey, this is a post-production thing. Like if I go to that's obviously not, that's not going to work, right? So we just want to choose all these settings to basically have it like perfectly match our photograph. And I think that looks pretty good. So there's the before and the after with our vignetting. So this can happen even after you crop your images, which is fantastic. We have a couple options for transforming our image, which honestly, I really don't do that much. Sometimes if you do have architecture and you want to make sure that your buildings are straight up, you can do that here within our transform. And then at the very bottom, we have a calibration. Generally, I leave this alone because cameras these days are so good. The software is so good at, talking with the cameras as well. Calibration is generally spot on. So I've actually never adjusted that in the history of using Lightroom. Alrighty. So there we have our basic editing tools within Lightroom Classic. So now let's go ahead and use these tools, take advantage of them, and apply a couple edits to our photos. So the first thing I want to do is create a little bit of a plan with this photo. I want to make sure that we haven't blown out information in our highlights. So let's go ahead and turn our highlight warning on. Now I'm going to bring my color temperature down a little bit. I want this to be a little bit more blue. There we go. Fantastic. Oh, and you can see as I brought my color temperature down, I'm going to add a little bit more green to there too. Maybe that's a little bit too much blue. I'm going to take my highlights and bring those down just a little bit there as well. Okay, now our texture and our clarity, we're going to go ahead and bring those up. Looks like I need to bring my highlight levels down a little bit more. Fantastic. Let's go ahead and turn that off because our highlights are just about where we need them to be. That's looking really good. And we're going to go ahead and bring up our vibrance. And then let's go back down here to our post-crop vignetting. There we go. And I'm just going to make some small adjustments here to make sure that that looks really nice. Okay, well, fantastic. Let's go back to our original. So here's basically when we imported our image. You can see we don't have much information here in our highlights. We have a decent bit of vignetting, and the image is a little bit desaturated to my tastes. So afterwards, there we have quite a big transformation of our photo. Now, it can be really helpful to see a before and after with your images. So in Lightroom, just click right down here where you have this little Y. I'm going to click here and go to before and after on the left and the right. So here's our image before, and here's our after. You can see these transformations really are nice. And keep in mind that you can change this at any point in time. For instance, if you think you made it too blue, we can just go ahead and make some adjustments moving back towards the center. I think that looks fantastic. Alrighty, well, let's go ahead and move on to our second example. So this time we're gonna hit G for our grid view, where we can see all of our images, and now you can see our edited image appears right here in our series. We're gonna go to our next image. This is Intro to Lightroom 30. Let's go ahead and double click on this, and then go to our Develop module. Now, for now, we can keep this before and after up while we edit if you'd like that, or you can click right down here and turn it off. I actually think it's gonna be nice having the before and after available while we're editing. So what's happening in our image, I think our shadows are just a little bit too dark. So what we're gonna do is start by bringing our exposure up just a little bit. There we go. That's looking good overall. I wanna bring our vibrance up because look at these blues and this yellow. I really want that to kind of like stand out. That's looking really, really nice. Now, as I brought my exposure up just a little bit, there we go, that's looking really good. I noticed that the highlights, especially like in my subject's face, for instance, they're getting a little bit bright here. So let's go ahead and take our highlight values and bring them down a little bit. And look at that, you can see how it just targets those highlights, okay? And of course, we have our before on the left and the after on the right. Okay, we're looking fantastic. Now let's go ahead and bring up our shadow values just a little bit more. And I think we're looking great. Let's bring up a little bit of texture and a little bit of clarity to our photo. And we're gonna scroll down here and add a little bit of sharpening. So our detail is gonna add a little bit of sharpening. We're gonna zoom in for this, okay? And I wanna bring up my radius. There we go. Let's bring up our sharpening levels, and we can see what happens to our image when I change my radius. So let's go here to I'm gonna do a 2:1 zoom so we can really see, okay? So if we have a smaller radius, it's gonna work with smaller pores, like smaller details, things like that. With a larger radius, it works on larger details, okay? Now, I've obviously way exaggerated this amount of sharpening. Generally, I won't sharpen anywhere near that. And let's go ahead and bring on masking, and that's gonna help protect some skin tones. So it's gonna still sharpen edges and things like that, but here where we have detail in the skin, masking is gonna really help out with that, which is fantastic. Okay, well, let's go ahead and bring up our radius a little bit higher. All right, and we'll bring our detail down just a little bit more. That looks great. Keep in mind, we're at 200% zoom here. So let's go back to a 1:1, and then we'll zoom out from there. All right, and that level of sharpening looks fantastic. Now, from here, if you wanted to do any type of coloring, we could do that as well. So let's go back up here to where we have our hue, saturation, and luminance. And we're gonna go to our hue slider. I mean, honestly, if you wanted to like change the color of our subject's sweatshirt, you could do that by clicking and dragging the hue slider, which is kind of fun. Now, in this case, it's gonna affect the color of our subject's skin as well. In our next episode, we're gonna show you some advanced editing in Lightroom, and we'll show you how to avoid that. For now, I wanna go ahead to my saturation, and we're just gonna bump our saturation of our blues up a little bit more, because I really want that like, you know, feeling of like, oh yeah, we get like a nice summer day with bright, bright colors. Fantastic. And let's go ahead and bring our exposure up just a tiny bit more and our highlights down just a little bit. Fantastic. I'm gonna bring our contrast down a tiny bit too. Well, I think this is looking great. So as we can see, here's our before and the after. And of course I can go anywhere on my history and I can just step back in time. For instance, if I, wanna see, hey, maybe this clarity was a little bit too much, okay? Comparing the before and after. In fact, I think it was a little bit much with that clarity. So let's go back up here to our current and then check this out. I'll just take my clarity and bring that down a little bit, okay? As well as my texture, and we're good to go. So it's a very easy way. Not only can we see our before and after, but any changes can be made at any point in time. So that's all there is to our basic image editing in Lightroom. You can see these tools are incredibly powerful. Now, if you want to just edit specific areas of your photo, we're covering that in our next video with our advanced editing techniques. Now, one more thing I want to point out is that these changes are only taking place in Lightroom. It doesn't actually change the image on your hard drive. In order to get that, you have to go through an export process and export out a new photo, and we're going to show you how to do that later in the series. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I've actually got a special gift for you. Just follow the link right down below. We're offering a free sample 10-pack of Lightroom presets, which basically do all of your image editing for you. Absolutely fantastic. You can click on your screen or the link right down below to download this free sample 10-pack. And if you're into it, we have amazing Lightroom presets available on Phlearn.com, all of which are included in Phlearn Pro, as well as every single tutorial we've ever made. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy them. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.